The Clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Sentencing Guidelines Pre-Sentence Reports Bill, second reading.
Now.
Minister to move the second reading. Lord Chancellor.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the bill now be read a second time. When I spoke in this House on the 1st of April, I set out the Government's intention to introduce emergency legislation because I believe that our justice system must be, above all else, fair, and that standing before a judge, we are all equal, no matter the colour of our skin or the question of our faith. Given the existential nature of this matter for our justice system, I was clear that we would move at pace to change the law. The Sentencing Guidelines Pre-Sentence Reports Bill was introduced that same day. With this second reading debate taking place just 3 weeks later, we are forging ahead with plans to legislate as quickly as possible. Before I set out the contents of the bill, I think it bears repeating how we came to be in the current situation and why expedited legislation is necessary. In the last Parliament, the Sentencing Council put forward revised guidelines on the imposition of community and custodial sentences. I should note that, during a statutory consultation, they were welcomed by the last Conservative government in no uncertain terms. The Shadow Transport Secretary, who was a Justice Minister at the time, should be able to furnish his colleagues with the details, but as he is absent today, I will do so, but I'll give way first.
Thank the Right Honourable Lady for giving way. Can she clarify, were the guidelines proposed under the previous government the same as the ones that she's dealing with now, or did they differ? And if they differed, how did they differ?
Lord Chancellor.
They did not differ in any substantial way, and all of the guidelines, insofar as they relate to issues relating to race and religion or culture or belief, are exactly the same as what the previous Justice Minister under the Conservative administration responded to. And I'm afraid hiding behind that shows a failure to reckon with their own track record, which has become quite the hallmark of the opposition in recent weeks and months. These guidelines, Madam Deputy Speaker, help judges when sentencing an offender to determine whether to make a community order or custodial sentence, providing guidance on the thresholds for these types of disposals. In the process of deciding which threshold has been met, judges are required by law to obtain a pre-sentence report, except in circumstances where they consider a report to be unnecessary. The reports are used to give the court more context of the offending behaviour in a given case and set out any factors which should be considered as part of the sentencing process. As I said to the House on the 1st of April, generally speaking, I am in favour of the use of pre-sentence reports, and in fact, I have recently freed up capacity in the probation service precisely so that it has more time to produce reports of this type. I give way to the Honourable Judge.
To the Right Honourable Lady for giving way. The Chairman of the Sentencing Council has argued that the sentence should be tailored to the offender. Does she agree with me that my constituents, and I suspect hers, think that the sentence should be tailored to the offence? The offence and its effect on the victim. That's what counts, not the background or circumstances or history or origins of the offender.
Lord Chancellor.
I think that what the purpose of the pre-sentence reports, used properly, is to provide the court with a full context of the offending behaviour, and that enables the court to ensure that when it's imposing a custodial sentence, that will be a successful and capable of being delivered custodial sentence in respect of that offender, or a community sentence instead. So it is a useful mechanism that a judge has at their disposal. We would expect it to be used in all cases except where the court considers it unnecessary because they have all of the information at their disposal. And because I consider pre-sentence reports to be so important in giving the courts all of the information they need at their disposal in order to pass the right sentence for the offender in front of them, I have specifically freed up capacity in the probation service so it can do more work of this type. However, the updated guidelines specifically encourage judges to request them for some offenders and not for others, and stipulating circumstances in which a pre-sentence report would normally be considered necessary, and that is the bit that I am seeking to change. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
To the Right Honourable Lady for giving way, and I think she said something very important there, which was that she said normally she would expect a pre-sentence report to be given in all, or at least almost all cases. I hope that is her position, because what seems unfair to me is that a pre-sentence report, which presumably enables people to bring forward arguments in mitigation, should be available to some people who've been convicted of a crime, but not to others. And surely it should either be available to everyone or to no one, because everybody's individual circumstances deserves the same degree of consideration.
Lord Chancellor.
He is absolutely right, and in fact we fully support Section 30 of the Sentencing Code, the Sentencing Act of 2020, which makes it very clear that a court has to get a pre-sentencing report unless it considers it unnecessary to do so. And that will be in cases where the judge considers they've already got all of the facts at their disposal in order to make a determination for what would be the correct sentence for any particular offender. And in fact, on that specific point, I think where the Sentencing Council got things right in the current guideline is before the paragraph, which is the subject of the debate in the bill today, they said PSRs are necessary in all cases that would benefit from an assessment of one or more of the following: the offender's dangerousness and risk of harm, the nature and causes of the offender's behaviour, the offender's personal circumstances, and any factors that may be helpful to the court in considering the offender's suitability for different sentence lengths or requirements. So I think that does cover all of the areas in which we would normally consider PSRs to be necessary, and I would want them to be more extensively used than they currently have been, and in fact I would wish them to be the norm in all cases, because I do think that they offer important information to people who are passing sentence, unless of course it's unnecessary, i.e. the judge is already furnished with all of the details, because they will have of course heard the whole of a case taking place before them, I believe. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm extremely grateful to the Lord Chancellor for giving way, and she's just given us very helpfully the list of things that might be relevantly considered in a pre-sentence report. But as she says, one of the things on that list is personal circumstances. That is what this bill will remove from the Sentencing Council's discretion. Can I just ask her why she hasn't used in the bill the language which is included in the explanatory notes, which says in paragraph 8 that what the bill does is to prevent differential treatment, and it goes on to say it does this by preventing the creation of a presumption regarding whether a pre-sentence report should be obtained based on an offender's membership of a particular demographic cohort. Now that seems to me to be a much narrower exclusion, and perhaps one better targeted at the problem that she, in my view, has rightly identified.
Chancellor.
I mean, he is right, and that is why we've offered the additional context in the explanatory note. Of course, personal characteristics and personal circumstances have, over the years, been elided in different court judgments, and sometimes the definitions between the two have slipped. And I wanted to make clear in the legislation that we are passing that we are constraining the Sentencing Council's ability to create guidance for PSRs in relation to personal characteristics, and that's why in the legislation we have set out race, religion, culture, or belief, specifically so that it is understood by the Sentencing Council we are targeting this part of the offending imposition guideline. Of course, they will then interpret how they see personal circumstances and personal characteristics applying. My expectation would be that all things that it will be analogous to protected characteristics in the Equality Act in terms of how the courts are likely to approach the question of what is a personal characteristic for the purpose of this bill. But I wanted to make it very clear to the Sentencing Council and everybody else what the intention of this legislation. It is very tightly focused on the offending bit of the imposition guideline. It leaves the wider question of personal circumstances untouched. And as I will come to later in my speech, there is helpful Court of Appeal guidance on circumstances and other times when a pre-sentence report should normally be required, and nothing in this bill will affect the previous Court of Appeal precedents that have already been set. I give way to my honourable friend.
Is the Lord Chancellor aware that the Sentencing Council guidelines, and in addition, this legislation we are debating at second reading today, turn on issues that some of us have campaigned on for decades? And I think there would be concern if this legislation being debated at second reading undermined the independence of the judiciary?
Chancellor.
Well, it absolutely does not undermine the independence of the judiciary. And what I would say to my honourable friend is, look, there is a long tradition of campaigners, including herself, who have a long track record of campaigning on issues relating to disparities within the criminal justice system and, in fact, disparities across wider society. And so far as those disparities relate to the criminal justice system, my strong view is those are matters of policy. Yep. Parliament is the proper place for that policy to be debated, and Parliament is the proper place for us to agree on what the best mechanism is for dealing with those problems. It is not within the purview of the Sentencing Council, because this is a matter of policy. Judges apply the laws that are passed by this House. That is their correct and proper function. I will always uphold their independence in doing so and never interfere with that. But this turns on a matter of policy, and it is right that the government of the day seeks to have a response to this issue, a policy response, and it's right that it's debated and ultimately legislated for in this House. I give way to the honourable gentleman, and then I'll come back here. Thank you.
Can I thank the Lord Chancellor very much for our presentation and also for the answers to the questions so far. I think every one of us believes that the foundational principle of justice is blind, must be adhered to in every way it can be. But we live in an age where there's an ever-changing political correctness, which, whether we like it or whether we don't, it invades here, it invades the life that we have. I'm very much in favour of what the Lord Chancellor said about race and faith, for instance, and I obviously as one person of faith, and I want to see that at the top of the tree when it comes to making sure that things aren't that there can never be a mitigating or an aggravating factor within justice. Can the Lord Chancellor just confirm for us all, in the life that we live, the world that we live in, with all the things that impact upon us daily and in this House as MPs, that faith and justice and religion will always be preserved in the way that it should be? Thank you.
Chancellor.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. I'll observe firstly, one of the most moving parts of the parliamentary day for me is when the day starts with prayers. Those are Christian prayers. I'm of the Muslim faith, but I find always those prayers something moving to be a part of and to hear, and it reminds us that we all belong to a country with a long heritage, a heritage steeped in faith, and many of our laws, if you are saying what is the source code for much of the law of England and Wales, it would be the Bible to begin with. So I think that he makes some broader points on the issue of faith and how important it is, and I suspect he and I have a lot in common in that regard. But what must never happen is that there must never be differential treatment before the law of our land, before any court, on the basis of faith.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Lord Chancellor's point about parliamentary sovereignty and that policy must be determined by this place? I think many members across the House will have been quite shocked by the response of the Sentencing Council to her letter when she asked them to consider these guidelines again. Does she agree with me that if this place continues to butt heads with the Sentencing Council over guidelines like this, maybe the best thing to do is abolish the Sentencing Council?
Lord Chancellor.
Well, look, I've had constructive conversations with the Sentencing Council, and I've made it very clear I don't really do personal, and I certainly wouldn't do it in relation to the judiciary, whose independence I uphold and whose security I am ultimately responsible for, and I take those responsibilities very seriously. I swore an oath on my holy book, and that means a huge amount to me. What I will observe is there is a clear difference here about where the line is drawn in terms of matters of policy and matters which are correctly within the purview of the judiciary, which is how the law should be applied in the cases that they hear. And I am simply making it very clear, this is policy, it is for this place to determine. But as I will come to later in my speech, obviously what this situation has highlighted is that there is potentially a democratic deficit here, and that is why I'm reviewing the wider roles and powers of the Sentencing Council, and will legislate in upcoming legislation if necessary to do so. Madam Deputy Speaker, I will make more progress on my speech and give way to other colleagues later if people wish to intervene again. The updated guidelines specifically encourage judges to request them for pre-sentence reports for some offenders and not for others, stipulating circumstances in which a pre-sentence report would normally be considered necessary. This included cases involving offenders from ethnic, cultural or faith minorities. In other words, a pre-sentence report would normally be considered necessary for a black offender or a Muslim one, but not necessarily if they are Christian or white. And we must be clear about what that means. By singling out one group over another, all may be equal, but some are more equal than others. We must also be honest about the impact that this could have. Equipped with more information about one offender than another, the court may be less likely to send that offender to prison, and I consider this guidance, therefore, to be a clear example of differential treatment. And as such, it risks undermining public confidence in a justice system which is built on the idea of equality before the law. Yes, I will.
I thank the Lord Chancellor for giving way. Given that the Sentencing Council refused the Lord Chancellor's first invitation to rewrite their guidance, is she confident that the limited nature of this bill is sufficient? And wouldn't she wiser to take a broader power to ensure that all sentencing guidance has an affirmative vote in this place in future?
Lord Chancellor.
I think it's right that moving at pace, I have sought to have a targeted bill that deals with this particular imposition guideline. I have made it very clear that I am conducting a wider review of the role and the powers of the Sentencing Council. If we need to legislate further in maybe the way that he suggests, or other mechanisms are also potentially available, then I will do so. I'm not ruling out further legislation. In fact, it's very much on the table. But I think it's right that moving quickly in order to deal with the problems caused by the potential of this guideline coming into force, that I've taken the targeted action in this short but focused bill. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I told the House a few weeks ago, I had several discussions with the Sentencing Council in the time leading up to the 1st of April, when the updated guidelines were due to come into force. And I do reiterate my gratitude to the Council's Chair, Lord Justice William Davis, for engaging with me on this issue, and ultimately for making the right call, pausing these guidelines while Parliament has its say. I should say again that I have no doubt whatsoever of the noble intentions behind the proposed changes. I understand the problem the Sentencing Council was attempting to address. Racial inequalities exist in our justice system, and they are evident in the sentencing disparity between offenders from different backgrounds. But as the Sentencing Council acknowledges, the reasons for this are unclear. Addressing inequalities in the justice system is something that this government takes very seriously, and we are determined to increase confidence in its outcomes, which is why we are working with the judiciary to make the system more representative of the public that it serves. I've also commissioned a review of the data my department holds on disparities in the justice system to better understand the drivers of the problem. But while I agree with the Sentencing Council's diagnosis, I believe they have prescribed the wrong cure. Going ahead with the new guidelines would have been an extraordinary step to take. It would have been extraordinary because of what it puts at risk, the very foundations of our justice system, which was built on equality before the law. The unintended consequences of this would have been considerable. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the idea that we improve things for people in this country who look like me by telling the public that we will be given favourable treatment is not just wrong, it is dangerous. We are all safer in this country when everyone knows we are treated the same. If we sacrifice that, even in the pursuit of a noble ideal like equality, we risk bringing the whole edifice crashing to the ground. Absolutely. I know there are disagreements in this House with regards to the correct policy to pursue, not least between the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, who opposes these guidelines, and the now Shadow Transport Secretary, whose support for them I have noted already. Though I suppose that does assume that the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice really is who he shows himself to be today. I must admit, I have begun to question whether his principles are set or really of no fixed abode. He did pose as a Cameroon centrist, after all, for so many years, and only recently became his party's populist flag bearer. It is enough to make me wonder whether he is, in fact, a Marxist. But one of the Groucho variety. These are my principles, he says, and if you don't like them, he has others. But regardless of our positions on this question of policy, I think there is one thing that is clear. This is a question of policy. How the state addresses an issue that is systemic, complex and of unclear origin is a question of what the law should be, not how the law should be applied. And let me be clear about that distinction. Parliament sets the laws. The judiciary determine how they are applied, and they must be defended as they do so. I will always defend judicial independence, and as I've said earlier, I swore an oath to do so when I became the Lord Chancellor. And given the Shadow Lord Chancellor's recent diatribes, including just hours ago in this place, he might want to equate himself too with that oath, if he ever intends to succeed me in this position. Though I suppose I am assuming that it is really my job that he wants and not that of the leader of the opposition. I will give way.
Lord Chancellor for giving way. I think she just said that the approach that the Sentencing Guidelines Council had taken put the foundation of the justice system at risk. Given that, how can she have confidence in a sentencing council that takes such an approach?
Well, I've engaged constructively with the Sentencing Council and will continue to do so, and I have legislated, and I'm in the process of legislating, in order to prevent this imposition guideline from ever coming into force. It has currently been paused. I think that was the right step for the Sentencing Council to take, and I am conducting a wider review of the roles and the powers of the Sentencing Council. It's right that I take a bit more time to think carefully about that and what we want them to do and what we might not want them to do, or how we might right the democratic deficit that has been uncovered. I think it's very clear, actually, from the action I'm taking, the approach I have towards the Sentencing Council. I give way again.
I don't think anyone's questioning the firm action that she's taking. The point my honourable friend has just made is, why should it be necessary for her to take that action? Surely, if the Sentencing Council can't see the distinction that she makes between its proper role and Parliament's proper role, then they're not fit to do the job.
Well, they might rightly argue that, given that the guideline was welcomed by the former government, they probably thought they were on safer ground than I consider them to be. But there is clearly this confusion or a change in practice or a development in ways that I disagree with in terms of the proper line between that which is practice and the application of the law and that which is properly in the realm of policy. And that is the thing that I am absolutely not going to give any ground on and which I will be setting right.
Sir John Hayes.
The right lady's right about that moving process, as she described, that trend. But the trouble is, it's part of a bigger problem, isn't it? The problem of judicial activism. And this isn't new. So for some time now, judicial activists have sought to do exactly what she said. And it's they that endanger the separation of powers, not people in this House.
Very good.
Lord Chancellor.
It is always up to the people in this House, however, if they feel that the law is being applied in ways in which it was not intended in order to put that law right. So I'm afraid in his comment it's a rather damning indictment of 14 years of Conservative government, 14 years of setting back and maybe allowing other people to do the policy work that perhaps ministers in the previous government didn't have the time or the inclination to do so for themselves. I don't think judges, in applying the law, are doing anything. They are doing their job. They are public servants. They do so independently. It is right that we have an independent judiciary in this country. We are very lucky to have a judiciary that is world-class and highly regarded. It's one of the reasons why so many businesses want to do business here in this country from all over the world, because they know that they can trust our court system and they can trust in the independence of our judges. And I think it is incumbent on the whole of this House to defend the independence of that judiciary, because it has been hard-won. It is one of our absolute USPs as a rule of law jurisdiction in this country, and none of us must ever do anything that puts it at risk. And if there are issues about the ways in which the law is being applied, if Parliament ever considers or ministers ever consider it strayed too far from the original intention, then we can always legislate, and I think I'm doing just that today. And that is an example, I hope, that if others have issues in their areas, they might consider taking as well. It is a question of policy, and that should be decided and debated here in this place and in this House. and it is the public who must be able to hold us to account for the decisions we take. I'll make a little more progress, but I will come back to the Honourable Lady. Rewarding or punishing us at the ballot box as they see fit. This is the domain of government, politics and Parliament, and today we reassert our ability to determine this country's policy on the issue of equality of treatment before the law. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Caroline Johnson. I thank the Right Honourable Lady for giving way. She's making a point about the wider justice system and the importance of equality in front of the law. What has she done to ensure and assure herself, and can she do to assure the House, that in all aspects of her department, people are being treated equally under the law, whether that be on parole, the way they're treated in prison, bail conditions and elsewhere?
Lord Chancellor.
Well, I've ordered a wider review into all guidance across the whole of the Ministry of Justice insofar it relates to equality before the law, to make sure that the problems that we have uncovered here are not replicated elsewhere. There is the issue that has already been discussed in the House earlier on today in relation to bail guidance, which I've already ordered a review on and which is being redrafted as we speak. That particular guidance is something like 20 years in the making. It has been added to over many years, and so the redraft of that has to be careful and make sure that it doesn't have any unintended consequences, but that is work that we are cracking on with and at pace, and I will make sure that by the time I'm done we can all be absolutely clear that this sweep towards allowing in potential differential treatment is sorted out once and for all. If she'll forgive me, I will make more progress. I think I have been more than generous. Madam Deputy Speaker, that brings me to the bill before us today. While the updated Sentencing Council guidelines are currently paused, if we do not act, they will come into force. Well, there was a lot to say, I think, gentlemen, about the previous government's track record, and it needed to be said. And I don't think he should mind me taking interventions from people on his own side. That is a novel approach for the shadow front bench to take. Let me turn to the specifics of the bill. It is tightly focused, containing just 2 clauses. Clause 1 amends Section 120 of the Coroners and Justice Act 2009, the Act which brought the Sentencing Council into existence. It dictates that the guidelines the Council produces may not include references to personal characteristics, including race, religion or belief or cultural background. Clause 2 is concerned with details about how the bill will be enacted, that it will apply only to England and Wales, and that its measures will come into force on the day after it passes. I think it is also important, Madam Deputy Speaker, to be clear about what the bill does not do. It does not stop the Sentencing Council from issuing broader guidance concerning requests for pre-sentence reports in those cases where it is helpful for the court to understand more about an offender's history and personal circumstances. The bill does not interfere with the court's duties to obtain a pre-sentence report in appropriate cases, for example, those involving primary carers and victims of domestic abuse. And as detailed in the bill's explanatory notes, it does not change existing precedent. Where the courts have determined that pre-sentence reports are necessary or desirable, in cases like Thompson, where the Court of Appeal recently emphasised their importance in sentencing pregnant women or women who have recently given birth, and Meanley, in which the court referenced the value of pre-sentence reports for young defendants, or Kermakaj, where the defendant had a traumatic upbringing, vulnerability, and was a victim of modern slavery. Instead, the bill narrowly focuses on the issue at hand, putting beyond doubt a principle which finds its ancient origins in Magna Carta and has developed over the centuries to serve the interests of justice, not just here, but in jurisdictions around the world. That each of us, no matter who we are, where we come from, or what we believe, stand equal before the law of the land. Madam Deputy Speaker, wider questions do remain about the role and the powers of the Sentencing Council, as I have already noted. The Council does important work, bringing consistency to judicial decision-making, but it is clear in this instance that it went beyond its original remit. It sought to set policy which stood out of step with the government of the day, and therefore it raises the question, who should set sentencing policy? Today's legislation only addresses this question in the narrowest terms, considering the guidance on pre-sentence reports. It does not give us a definitive resolution as to whether it is government ministers or members of the Sentencing Council who should decide policy in the future, and as I've noted already, that leaves us with a democratic deficit. As I told the House on the 1st of April, the question of the role and powers of the Sentencing Council must therefore be considered further. That work is already underway in my department. Should further legislation be required, the Government will include it in upcoming legislation. The Sentencing Council plays an important role in our justice system, and any changes to it must be made carefully and with the consideration that it deserves. I am sure they will be discussed more in this House in the months ahead, and I welcome the opportunity to debate them. Madam Deputy Speaker, while the bill we are debating today is small, the issues it contains could not be of greater significance. I know the majority of Honourable and Right Honourable members in this House would agree that the Sentencing Council's intentions on this issue were noble. But in trying to reach for equality of outcome, they sacrificed too much, undermining the sacred principle of equality before the law. It is right that we, as policymakers, stop these updated guidelines from coming into force. We must stand up for the idea that no matter our race or religion, no person should receive preferential treatment as they stand in the dock before a judge. And so I beg to move that the bill now be read a second time.
The question is that the bill be read a second time. Shadow Lord Chancellor Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So how did we get here? It takes a special kind of uselessness to engineer a crisis entirely of your own making, and then to come to this House asking for applause as you legislate your way out of it. Let's remind ourselves what actually happened here. The Sentencing Council, an unelected, unaccountable quango created by the Labour Party, issued guidance that would have divided our criminal justice system by race, religion and identity. A two-tier system as offensive to common sense as it was to the most basic and important principle of equality before the law. The Justice Secretary, asleep, I'll come back to the Honourable Gentleman, the Justice Secretary, asleep at the wheel, either didn't know or didn't care. Her officials signed off the guidance. Her ministry nodded it through. The Council published it. The guidance was due to come into force. Only then, after I raised this issue with her in this House and in the face of fierce opposition from this side of the House, from the press, from the public, did the Justice Secretary rouse herself from her stupor. Only then did she discover her principles. But even at that point, she didn't act decisively. She didn't use her powers to sack the architects of this shameful guidance. She didn't support my legislation or bring forward immediate legislation of her own to stop it. No. What did she do? She wrote a letter begging the Council to reconsider. And such is the pace at which she moves, or rather crawls, it took a further 7 days to put her thoughts after a meeting in writing. When they didn't move, she threatened action, only to be humiliated by the chair of the Council, who made clear that if she tried, he would take legal action and potentially challenge his own Justice Secretary. So incompetent was the Justice Secretary that we on this side of the House had to take it upon ourselves to prepare a judicial review to do the Justice Secretary's job for her. And such was the level of chaos over which she was now nominally presiding, the government's own legal service was trooped out against us to defend the very sentencing guidelines the Justice Secretary had denounced as two-tier. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Shadow Minister for giving way. In November 2023, the Sentencing Council consulted on these guidelines, and in it said it may be particularly important if an offender belonged to an ethnic minority, cultural minority, and/or faith minority community in terms of getting a pre-sentence report. Does the Shadow Minister agree? I don't, that it was particularly important. And if he doesn't agree that it was particularly important, why did he say nothing for 2 years?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman, you have to applaud him for reading out his whip's questions there. But I do wish I've said it before and I'll say it again. I do wish that both he and the front bench would stop perpetuating something which is obviously untrue. They know it's untrue. It's been said numerous times. The Sentencing Council themselves... Let me finish my point, because it's an important...
The Shadow Lord Chancellor has just suggested that the government front bench is perpetuating an untruth. He might like to think whether he wishes to withdraw that comment.
Well, it is, I hope, inadvertent, Madam Deputy Speaker, but the Sentencing Council wrote to the Lord Chancellor, correcting her on this very point. They made clear that the guidance that was put before the last Conservative government was materially different to the one, was materially different. Let me finish the point. If he doesn't like the answer, perhaps he should hear it in full. The Sentencing Council made clear that the guidance that were put to the last Conservative government was materially different to the one that was ultimately put forward to this Labour government. And they said in the previous iteration that pre-sentencing reports would usually be required. There was a presumption in that pre-sentencing reports would come forward, but importantly, it preserved full discretion. The guidance that was ultimately brought forward and given the nod by her officials who were present at the final meeting of the Sentencing Council made a very significant distinction. They said they must be requested. That removed the sentencing... Let me finish it. That removed the presumption... it removed the discretion available to judges. And that was a very significant difference. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
So I have the pre-sentencing report's guidance in front of me. Would the honourable gentleman agree that what it says is when considering a community or custodial sentence, the court must request and consider a pre-sentence report before forming an opinion of the sentence, unless it considers it unnecessary. It then goes on to say various circumstances in which it might be considered necessary and may normally be considered necessary. It does not remove judicial stipulations and interventions completely, and to suggest otherwise is not accurate.
Shadow Lord Chancellor.
No, it does not use that phrase. It says would usually be required. And that's an important point, because it removes the discretion. Of course, there might be instances in which a judge would do so, but I think it would be extremely unlikely in practice that a judge would choose not to take forward a pre-sentence report in light of that new guidance. And so that is why we felt it was so important to take action. Let me make some progress. Eventually, the Sentencing Council did U-turn, but it was not in time for the guidance. It was not before the guidance had briefly come into force. The Sentencing Council took until midday on the 1st of April, several hours after the guidance had come into force, to update magistrates and judges. And their email undermined the Lord Chancellor yet again. It stated that they still believed the guidance was necessary and appropriate. The whole saga, Madam Deputy Speaker, has been nothing short of farcical. It's been an embarrassment. It has damaged public confidence in the justice system. And the Justice Secretary's bill today doesn't fix that trust deficit. It is half-baked. It is a half job that stores up problems for another day. Because make no mistake, we will be back here again. Like Groundhog Day, we'll be back again and again. The Justice Secretary has left the very same individuals in post at the Sentencing Council, the same people who drafted these rules and declined her initial invitation to change them. She's left the system intact, and she's left the door wide open for it to happen again. Now, this isn't hypothetical. We know for a fact that more offensive two-tier sentencing guidelines are incoming. The Sentencing Council is currently consulting on new immigration guidelines, which water down sentences for people smugglers. If they come into force, it will mean hundreds of immigration offenders a year would avoid the 12-month threshold for automatic deportation, blowing a hole in border controls. If the Justice Secretary wanted to stop this, and there will be plenty of open border activists who would oppose her, this bill leaves her powerless to do so. She's chosen to be powerless. It is the definition of madness to repeat the same decisions and expect different results. History will keep repeating itself until ministers take back control of sentencing frameworks. But here we are, Madam Deputy Speaker, and still the Justice Secretary stands at the dispatch box and claims there will be no two-tier justice under her leadership. But this bill fixes one small element of the problem and leaves the rest entirely intact. It does nothing to stop the two-tier pre-sentence report guidance, which still instructs probation officers to take into account so-called intergenerational trauma, not suffered by the defendant themselves, but presumably by their ancestors. It does nothing to stop the bail guidance issued by her own ministry, which instructs officials to prioritise ethnic minority defendants for bail decisions, not on the facts of the offence, not on the risk to the public, but because of their racial or cultural identity. It does nothing to stop the Equal Treatment Bench Book, the official handbook for judges, which is riddled with activist talking points, including the claim that migrants are mistreated by the press, and the adoption of a dangerously expansive definition of Islamophobia that could amount to a backdoor blasphemy law. Madam Deputy Speaker, everywhere you look, and more examples emerge every week, inside the Ministry of Justice, this ideology runs through the system like rot through the rafters. The principle of equality before the law, one of the great inheritances of our country, is being systematically inverted, replaced by cultural relativism, by a hierarchy of victimhood. Some defendants to be treated gently, others to face the full force of the law, all depending on their background, their race, their religion, or their self-declared identity. This is not justice. It is injustice, wrapped in the language of confession. But compassionate to who? To the victims? Of course not. They don't get a look in. I'll give way.
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend, who deserves great credit for championing the cause of justice and obliging the government to follow suit, albeit grudgingly. Does he acknowledge that, leaving aside the fundamental injustice that he described, the two-tier justice system, that what the Sentencing Council proposed and continues to do in all the ways it's described undermines popular faith in the rule of law and justice, and, as the Lord Chancellor herself says, tears the whole system apart?
Robert Jenrick.
I think that is the very real risk of what we're seeing, not just in these aborted sentencing guidelines, but the broader fabric of two-tier justice that we are revealing with every passing day. What we all want to see, and is what I believe the honourable member wants to see as well, I'll give way to him in a moment, is equality before the law. And that means in no instance should the law be being applied differently, depending on the colour of your skin or the faith that you abide by. We must all fight against that, because that is immensely corrosive to public trust and confidence in the criminal justice system.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. He's painting a terrifying picture of our justice system as we stand here today. In much of his work, has he managed to identify when it all started?
Shadow Lord Chancellor.
Well, the guidelines that we're talking about came into force, or would have done, under this Labour government. I won't return exactly to everything that I said earlier, but we all know, those of us who were in this very chamber on the day that I revealed this, that the Justice Secretary and none of her ministers had the faintest idea that any of this was happening. I watched the Justice Secretary look to her ministers, and she was greeted by blank faces. They had no grip on what was happening in their department. But yes, he does make a good point, that the issues that we're discussing today predate this Labour government. This is a broader issue facing our country. We all have to be defenders of equality under the law. And I don't seek equality of outcome within our criminal justice system. I seek equality of treatment. That is the heart of a fair criminal justice system. And that may be a point of difference between some of us in this House. All I seek is that every person in this country, man or woman, regardless of their religion or the colour of their skin, should be treated exactly the same by the law. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, everywhere you look, as we've just described, within the Ministry of Justice, you see this ideology. And the most worrying part of this is that I think the Justice Secretary knows it herself. She stood here and said that the appearance of differential treatment before the law is particularly corrosive, and I agree wholeheartedly with her. But I'll make a little bit of progress. But the guidance doesn't just create the appearance of two-tier justice, it is two-tier justice. And she can't wash her hands of that. The bail guidance comes from her own ministry. The pre-sentence guidance is issued by officials she oversees. The bench book is sanctioned by the Judicial College under the watch of the Lady Chief Justice. If the Justice Secretary truly believes in equality before the law, if her words are more than empty slogans, then why is any of this happening on her watch? The truth is simple. This bill is not the solution. It's a fig leaf. It's damage control. It's political theatre to distract from the deeper rot that this government has permitted to fester. Until this type of guidance is ripped out root and branch from sentencing, from bail, from judicial training and appointments, the principle of equality before the law remains under direct assault. We won't vote against this bill because we will never support two-tier justice. But we won't let the Justice Secretary rewrite history either. She didn't stop these rules. She didn't fight against them. She didn't even know about them until we pointed them out to her. She allowed them to happen, and then she panicked when the backlash came. Now she's using the time of this House to clean up her own mess. She wears the robes, she dons the wig, but she's not in control of the justice system. Absolutely. Despite the big talk today, there's still two-tier justice on her watch. And if she continues to do so little about it, we can only conclude that at heart, she truly supports it.
Mother of the House, Diane Abbott.
Madam Speaker, I can see that I am in a minority on this legislation in the House, but it is not the first time, and I suspect it won't be the last. There has been a great deal of misinformation about the Sentencing Council's original guidelines, both in the run-up to the debate and in this debate today. So I, with all humility, want to insert some facts into the debate. First of all, I think it's important to recognise what the Sentencing Council actually is. Much of the debate today, and much of the debate in recent weeks, seems to presume that the Sentencing Council is a bunch of heedless young barristers and social workers. On the contrary, the Sentencing Council is largely composed of some of the most senior judges in the land. They include Lord Justice William Davis, Court of Bar in 1976, and the chair, His Honour Judge Simon Drew, a circuit judge sitting in the Court of Appeal, Lord Justice Tim Holroyd, Lord Justice of Appeal and Vice President of the Court of Appeal, and the Honourable Mr Justice Mark Wall, who was appointed a High Court judge in 2020. And there are also some very senior probation officers and magistrates. Hardly a cohort of men and women who need the firm hand of an MP on their shoulder to explain to them what the rule of law is. So, of course.
He's making a very important point that the Sentencing Council is comprised of very senior and learned individuals. Given that that's the case, what circumstances do you think has conspired? Does she think has conspired to enable them to get this so very wrong? Because it's clear that on both sides of the House it's felt these guidelines are wrong. What circumstances do you think led them to get it so wrong?
Abbott.
I think I can say with confidence that why the Sentencing Council is talking about issues to do with race and criminal justice is because of a history which goes back decades of problematic issues in relation to race and criminal justice, and I will come on to those later. So I would also say about the Sentencing Council that their independence is crucial, and the idea that anybody in this chamber is standing up for law and order yet seeks to undermine the independence of the Sentencing Council and by implication the judiciary as a whole is quite remarkable. The next thing to say is, what do the guidelines actually say? Much of the debate today implies that black and minority persons have been singled out for pre-sentence reports in these guidelines. On the contrary, in the guidelines is a whole list of people the Sentencing Council suggests that judges and magistrates might ask for a pre-sentence report on. These persons include those at risk of their first custodial sentence, young adults, women, an ethnic minority, cultural minority, yes, of course, a pregnant and postnatal women, the sole or primary carer for dependent relatives. The Sentencing Council is clear that this is not an exclusive list. Ideally, every defendant should have a pre-sentence report. The aim of the guidelines is to ensure that judges and magistrates get the most information possible. Who could object to garnering more information on any defendant? And it is certainly not the intention of the guidelines to dictate the sentence in any given case. Yet it is being argued that a pre-sentencing report will be discouraging of a judge from sending an offender to jail. We are asked to believe that our judiciary is both weak-minded, susceptible, and will not live up to their centuries-old standards, which we've heard earlier go all the way back to the Magna Carta. But earlier the House was told that our judiciary is world-class and highly regarded. Both propositions cannot be true.
Yes, they can.
Decisions, well, either our judiciary is world-class and highly regarded, or it is so soft-minded that the very existence of a pre-sentencing report is going to make it rule in a way it wouldn't otherwise have ruled. The decisions by judges and magistrates on individual cases are not the same thing as policy. The Sentencing Council itself is very clear that they are not seeking to dictate policy. They are simply trying to make sure that judges and magistrates have the maximum amount of information. The leading King's Counsel, Keir Monteith, says that there has been a deliberate misleading of the rules to generate a row, and I believe this is correct. And then we come to the talk, which I've heard on both sides of the House, about two-tier criminal justice. And this can only mean that black defendants are treated more favourably than white defendants. But the facts tell us the contrary. Ministers will be aware of the Lammy Review, chaired by the member for Tottenham and our current Foreign Secretary. It was a review of race in the criminal justice system. He found that, in quotes, despite making up just 14% of the population, Black and ethnic minority men and women make up 25% of prisoners, while over 40% of young people in custody are from black and ethnic minority backgrounds. And he added, if our prison population reflected the makeup of England and Wales, we would have over 9,000 fewer people in prison, the equivalent of 12 average-sized prisons. The member for Tottenham did not find a criminal justice system where black and brown people are treated more favourably than white people, and he did not find equality before the law. And there's no reason to believe that things have changed since he drew up his review. We need to appreciate that not only do we have a two-tier system, but it's a two-tier system in completely the opposite way that the Lord Chancellor is suggesting, and has been that two-tier system for decades. What the population wants to see is a taking seriously of our two-tier criminal justice system. Members may remember the tragic death of Stephen Lawrence in the early 1990s. It took a Labour government and a Labour Home Secretary to commission a judge-led inquiry into the Stephen Lawrence case. In 1999, the Macpherson inquiry reported. It spoke in an unequivocal way about institutional racism in the police service. And it spoke about it in a way that I have never heard it spoke about in this House or at the very most senior levels in the state. And, you know, nobody since then has challenged the notion that there is institutional racism in the police force. Does it have to be that we have our own Macpherson inquiry into the workings of the judicial system for people to accept that institutional racism is an issue in the courts as well? It is not enough to say that, well, you know, the facts point in that direction, but we're not quite sure why the figures are like that. We know why the figures are like that, and we've known that for decades. If we want to, win the respect of the community as a whole, we have to be seen to be working towards a fair criminal justice system, not just trying to score points off the opposition. We have to look at the long term rather than the short term. We know that in England and Wales, black people are much more likely to be arrested than white people. Specifically, black individuals are twice more likely to be arrested than white individuals. This disparity extends to imprisonment, with black individuals being more likely to be sentenced to prison and serving longer sentences than their white counterparts. Everybody knows that people are not treated the same, and it is misleading of members on both sides of the House to imply that that is so. Peter Herbert, the chair of the Society of Black Lawyers, has said, "We have experienced racist, two-tier policing for over 500 years. If we achieve equal treatment, that is not two-tier, as it is long overdue. We have never asked for special treatment, but only equal treatment." And the Chancellor should pay attention to the wish of so many members of the community in our own constituency in Birmingham, in my constituency in East London, the wish of so many, millions of people in the community to see a fair criminal justice system which treats people fairly, not unfairly, as has happened in the past. Members will know that it took the Macpherson inquiry to get a measure of understanding about criminal justice in policing. In closing, I'll say this. It is interesting to hear the banter between the two front benches about this issue. But this is not an issue for banter. This is people's lives. This is people's liberty. And I don't think the debate is enhanced by some of the Trump-like narrative we're getting from the opposition. We don't need Donald Trump-type politics in Britain today. What we need is a seriousness about the unfairness and discrimination of the criminal justice system, and a willingness not just to talk about it, but to do something about it.
Person Josh Babarinde.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Liberal Democrats believe in equality before the law. Liberal Democrats believe in the rule of law. And Liberal Democrats believe that no one is above the law. And so it's heartening to hear that these words have been echoed across the chamber today. But actions speak louder than words, Madam Deputy Speaker, which is why I regret to say that few have acted more to erode these legal and democratic values than the two-tier Tory party who occupy the benches next to me. Two-tier Tories who unlawfully partied in Number 10 while the rest of us miss funerals for lost relatives. Two-tier Tories who unlawfully suspended Parliament to get their way while lecturing us about the rule of law. Two-tier Tories who unlawfully approved developments for their donor mates while purporting to talk tough on crime. Two-tier Tories whose unlawfulness, chaos and double standards landed them with the biggest election defeat in their history. And they still haven't learnt, Madam Deputy Speaker, because that hypocrisy continues today in the context of the sentencing guidelines in question. Earlier editions of these guidelines were nodded through by the Conservatives when in government, yet today they make a scene about these guidelines now that it's become politically convenient for them to do so. Just one MP, according to the Sentencing Council, objected to the cohorting in the previous guidelines that were put out to consultation in 2023-2024, and I will give way to the then Home Office Minister if he can confirm that it was him who made that objection. Radio silence. Our country deserves better. Our country deserves better than the circumstances, too, that have given rise to this bill.
That's your job.
The circumstances are ultimately that the last government underfunded our probation and court systems so severely that pre-sentence reports have since been rationed and are not used universally or anywhere near it. In fact, the use of pre-sentence reports has declined by 44% over the last decade almost, according to the Lord Timpson in the other place. And this is despite the Sentencing Code having a presumption in favour of the use of pre-sentence reports, regardless of any personal characteristic or personal circumstance that that individual has. And Liberal Democrats believe that this universal or near-universal presumption is critical because when the state is considering depriving someone of their liberty, judges and magistrates should be equipped with all the information possible to pass a sentence that is most likely to reduce reoffending and protect victims and survivors. Offenders need it, and victims deserve it. But Liberal Democrats believe that really we should be having a debate about how we can resource a criminal justice system that can fulfil a pre-sentence report for all offenders who need it, rather than a debate that feels grounded in rationing their use. We will therefore abstain on this bill, and abstain not because of indifference, but because of principled concerns that I will outline. I will constructively present to reciprocate the constructiveness with which the Secretary of State and her officials have engaged with me on this matter in recent weeks. One concern is that this bill simply is not necessary to achieve its stated aim. The Sentencing Council have, in response to the strength of feeling in this Parliament, paused the implementation of their guidelines. They have not said how long that pause would be, and my understanding is that the Department have not asked them how long they would be willing to pause those guidelines for. It seems to me that there is newfound space in response to the most recent act of the Lord Chancellor for an agreement to be reached through dialogue with the Sentencing Council, with the Lady Chief Justice, without requiring a single minute of primary legislation that could instead be devoted to legislating to patch up other injustices within our system. Another concern is that this proposal is being rushed through without comprehensive consultation or coordination with wider work that's already underway. David Gork is currently conducting an independent review of sentencing due to report this spring, and that review ought to have provided a clear opportunity to examine these issues in depth and to ensure that any reforms are evidence-based, balanced and considered in the broader context of sentencing policy. And if the government is convinced that primary legislation is required, why not wait for the Gork Review to report, take advantage of that independent insight, and then bring forward coherent proposals as part of legislation later in this session? An additional concern is that while the bill ostensibly gestures toward fairness, it fails to confront some of the most pressing injustices in our criminal justice system that were referred to by the mother of the House, including those also referred to by the Lammy Review. We know that there is disproportionality in most stages of the criminal justice process, affecting varying groups, whether it's around stop and search, charging decisions, early guilty pleas or not, and sentencing outcomes. And ethnic minority individuals, women, and those with mental health issues continue to be overrepresented and underserved. Yet this legislation makes no attempt to address that. And while I welcome the review that the Justice Secretary described, it is unwelcome that the outcome of those reviews or that data does not yet feature in legislation alongside these proposals. Finally, I'm deeply troubled with the political context in which this bill is being introduced. It may appear technical on the surface, but the legislation risks falling into a trap in which criminal justice is being used by some in this House and beyond to stoke division, to appeal to populist headlines, and to wage a cynical culture war. We must not allow our courts nor our sentencing practices to become pawns in that political game, nor part of a second stab at a Tory leadership campaign. And so it's critical that in this debate and in any reform we might make to sentencing policy, that we lead with an evidence-based process. We lead with a determination to tackle the injustices embedded in our criminal justice system, whether disproportionately affecting women, ethnic minorities, or white working-class boys. The list continues. We would therefore urge the government to listen, to reflect, to return with proposals that work with the Sentencing Council, work with the judiciary, work with the findings of David Gork's independent review of sentencing. Only then can we abolish the unjust two-tier system created under the two-tier Tories.
After the chair of the Justice Select Committee, I propose to put on a 4-minute time limit, but I'm very conscious that many members will be disappointed this evening. Andy Slaughter.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me begin by summarising how we got here. On the 29th of November 2023, the Sentencing Council launched a consultation on proposed changes to the imposition of community and custodial sentences guidelines. On the 19th of February 2024, the then Minister for Sentencing, the Honourable Member for Orpington, wrote to the Chair of the Council and welcomed the Council's work on the revised guideline, and in particular welcomed the fuller guidance around the circumstances in which courts should request a pre-sentence report. On the 28th of March 2024, the then Chair of the Justice Committee, Sir Bob Neal KC, wrote to the Chair of the Sentencing Council, noting that the Council had conducted a particularly effective consultation exercise. On the 5th of March 2025, a year later, the Sentencing Council published the revised guideline, saying it would come into effect on the 1st of April. The same day saw the first exchange in this chamber between the Lord Chancellor and the Shadow Lord Chancellor on the guideline. The accusation by the Shadow Lord Chancellor that the guidelines would make a custodial sentence less likely for those from an ethnic minority, cultural minority and or faith minority community was not the view of the Sentencing Council, but the exchange led to some extensive correspondence between the Lord Chancellor and the Chair of the Sentencing Council for the rest of March. I do not have time today to describe the contents of those letters, but the central point raised by the Chair of the Sentencing Council was that the purpose of a pre-sentence report is to provide information, not to determine the sentence. Frequently, he wrote, the information provided will not assist the offender's prospect of avoiding a custodial sentence, rather the reverse. He added, the guideline does not make a custodial sentence less likely for someone simply by way of their membership of a cohort. The guideline does not instruct or mandate judges to request a pre-sentence report. It is discretionary. The full list of cohorts is non-exhaustive. A pre-sentence report may be necessary for those outside the list. The section of the guideline relating to pre-sentence reports is directed to the issue of information about offenders, no more and no less. On the 31st of March 2025, following a meeting with the Sentencing Council, the Lord Chancellor said she was going to introduce legislation to render the section on cohorts unlawful. The guideline was due to come into force on the 1st of April. As a result, the Council said it would delay the date that the guideline was due to come into force pending such legislation taking effect. On the 1st of April 2025, this bill was given its first reading. The bill is designed to make it unlawful for a sentencing guideline issued by the Sentencing Council to include a presumption that a pre-sentence report should be obtained based on the offender's membership of a particular demographic cohort. The bill has one operative clause, Clause 1, which would amend Section 120 of the Coroners and Justice Act 2009. The drafting of Clause 1 indicates that the provision will apply to all sentencing guidelines that have been issued by the Sentencing Council and which are already in force when the provisions in this bill take effect. The bill states that guidelines produced by the Council cannot include provision framed by reference to personal characteristics. The bill then specifies that personal characteristics include, in particular, race, religion or belief and cultural background. The list is non-exhaustive and therefore also covers other personal characteristics, for example, age, disability, sex and sexual orientation. Clause 1 would therefore render unlawful the following cohorts which were included in the imposition of community and custodial sentences guidelines issued on the 5th of March. A young adult, female, from an ethnic minority, cultural minority and or faith minority community, pregnant or postnatal, has disclosed they are transgender, has or may have a serious chronic medical condition or physical disability or mental ill health, learning disabilities or brain injury or damage. The explanatory notes state that the bill does not prevent the Council from issuing guidelines advising courts to consider the offender's personal circumstances in deciding whether to request a PSR. The explanatory notes also state that the bill does not affect Court of Appeal case law on the circumstances where a pre-sentence report is either necessary or desirable. It then cites 3 cases. Thompson, which says that where a woman who is pregnant or has recently given birth is to be sentenced, it is desirable for the court to obtain a pre-sentence report. Meanly, where the court referred to the importance of pre-sentence reports in serious cases involving young defendants, and Kurmejaj, where the court said that the defendant's traumatic upbringing, vulnerability, and the fact that they had been a victim of modern slavery meant a pre-sentence report should have been requested. The government has repeatedly emphasised that it objects to the inclusion of the ethnic, cultural, faith minority community in the guideline. The government has not said that it objects to the inclusion of the other cohorts in the guideline framed by personal characteristics. The fact that the explanatory notes make clear that the government does not intend to prevent the Court of Appeal or any other body from issuing guidance relating to pre-sentence reports from being framed by personal characteristics other than ethnic, cultural and faith minority community would appear to indicate that it does not object in principle to such an approach. I'm sure some of these matters can be explored more at committee stage, but let me conclude by saying a few words about judicial independence. In his letter dated the 10th of March to the Lord Chancellor, the Chair of the Sentencing Council said, "There is general acceptance of the guidelines by the judiciary because they emanate from an independent body on which judicial members are in the majority. The Council preserves the critical constitutional position of the independent judiciary in relation to sentencing. The independence of the judiciary is recognised as a principle of fundamental importance to the United Kingdom's constitution. The principle serves to protect the judiciary's ability to exercise its functions in deciding cases in accordance with the law and free from external pressures. Deciding on an offender's sentence is a clear example of this. But the principle of judicial independence also requires that the judiciary is treated with respect and with recognition of the constitutional boundaries between the judiciary, the executive and Parliament. Lord Hodge, the Deputy President of the Supreme Court, said in 2018, "Within Parliament, it is a parliamentary custom, supported by rulers of the Speaker, that an attack on a judge's character or motives, or charges of a personal nature, or a call for his or her dismissal should only be made on a substantive motion on which a vote will be taken, and also that arguments that a judge has got a decision wrong should be made in moderate language." There has been significant criticism of the Sentencing Council, and in particular its chair, in this chamber. The Shadow Lord Chancellor said on the 1st of April in this House, "Can the Lord Chancellor honestly say at the dispatch box that she has confidence in the head of the Sentencing Council, Lord Justice Davis, given that he has brought it into total disrepute? To criticise the judiciary for their decisions in their capacity as members of the Sentencing Council risks undermining their independence as serving judges. It remains to be seen whether the measures in this bill have ripples beyond the narrow prescription in Clause 1, and I look forward to the government clarifying the detailed effects of the bill at committee stage. But it would be unfortunate, Madam Deputy Speaker, if such a modest piece of legislation left collateral damage to the relationship between Parliament, the Executive and the Judiciary in its wake.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think it is important in this debate to be clear about what we are talking about and what we are not. The part of the guideline the Sentencing Council produced, which has led to this legislation, relates to the circumstances in which a pre-sentence report is produced, not to the passing of a sentence itself. I also think it's important not to overstate the problem. As we've heard, there is already law that says there should be a pre-sentence report in almost all cases unless it's unnecessary, and most offenders being considered either for a community sentence or a custodial one, in the Crown Court at least, already have one. But the guidance that the Sentencing Council produces on the ordering of a pre-sentence report does matter. And that's because such a report is designed to give sentencers more information about the person they're sentencing. And without that information, it can be very hard to apply the full range of sentencing options. Whether that is about whether a rehabilitation activity requirement or a programme requirement might be appropriate, or indeed to assess capacity for unpaid work. And if, therefore, a sentencer does not order a pre-sentence report for a particular offender, they may not be able to impose some of the more demanding community sentences and find themselves more likely to impose a custodial sentence as the only available and realistic alternative. So it does matter whether a sentencer is being encouraged to order such a report for an offender or not. And any guideline which suggests this should be more appropriate for someone of one ethnicity, faith or culture as opposed to another cannot be right. And again, I accept that Sentencing Council were trying to do good here, but in reality you do not address inequality by replacing it with different inequality. So I do think the Sentencing Council have misjudged this, and I think the government are entitled to come to that view too. I also think it would have been better if legislation were not needed to resolve this issue, but the Sentencing Council, independent as we know it is, has clearly concluded that it will not do as the Lord Chancellor has asked, and that means legislation is the only realistic alternative. However, I do have concerns about the way the government is going about this, in particular the breadth of the drafting of the bill. And I mentioned an intervention on the Lord Chancellor, one specific, which I won't go over again in view of time, but we might return to in the later stages of the bill. I do think it's worth ministers considering whether the use of the phrase personal characteristics is too broad. The chairman of the Select Committee read out some of the other personal characteristics referred to in the draft guideline, which I don't think are anywhere near as controversial, and keeping in mind that this is about a process where a sentencer is given information about an offender in order to determine the appropriate sentence. I do not think that information about faith or ethnic origin would fall into the appropriate category, but information about health conditions or disabilities most certainly might. I do therefore think there is a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, and not all personal characteristics should be left out of account in sentencing. And therefore I would ask the ministers to consider whether they can tighten the wording of, in particular, Clause 1, Subclause 2 and Subclause 3. I think it will also, if they do so, avoid some rather arcane discussions about what can properly be described as personal circumstances and what can be properly described as personal characteristics. But I also think there's a danger of losing sight of the good work that the Sentencing Council does, and I accept this will not be a universally popular point of view, but I do think the Sentencing Council adds something important in the sentencing process, important that we don't lose sight of this, and important we don't lose sight too of the fact that the guideline that's been drafted here is to replace substantially out-of-date guidance. I hope that point will also be noted by ministers.
Dr. Allison Gardner. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whilst I acknowledge that the updated Sentencing Council guidelines attempted to address inequalities in the criminal justice system, we must maintain the principle of equality before law, and as such I support this bill. I note, however, that this bill does not prevent the Sentencing Council from issuing guidelines advising the courts to consider an offender's personal circumstances, particularly when they're uniquely linked to their personal characteristics, when deciding whether to request a pre-sentence report. I believe that pre-sentence reports are desirable when the defendant in question is a vulnerable woman who has committed a less serious crime. For instance, when they are pregnant or postnatal, the primary carer for dependent children, or a victim of domestic abuse or exploitation. And of course, these issues are often compounded when we consider intersectionality such as experienced by black women. So many women in the criminal justice system are vulnerable. Nearly 2/3 are victims of domestic abuse, a similar percentage have children, and many have experienced adverse childhood experiences and trauma. These vulnerability factors make it critical that personal circumstances affecting female offenders are given consideration in pre-sentence reporting. Women in custody have complex health needs, which can increase the risk associated with pregnancy for mothers and their children. Babies born in prison are twice as likely to be born premature, and they are 7 times more likely to be stillborn. These aren't just numbers, they affect real people women already experiencing trauma and babies entering the world in incredibly difficult circumstances. Consideration of pregnancy and the associated risks to mothers, their unborn children and their newborn babies is therefore critical to determine appropriate sentencing. Custodial sentences can often do more harm than good, both to pregnant women and their children. Women are far less likely to commit violent or sexual offences on average and are far more likely to be charged with petty crime, non-violent crime and theft. In these cases, community sentences may be preferred, so long as the offender does not present a risk to wider society. In April 2024, the Sentencing Council introduced a new mitigating factor, pregnancy, childbirth and postnatal care, in sentencing guidelines to consider the impact of custody on pregnant offenders and their dependents. This factor recognises that when the impact on offenders' dependents would be disproportionate to the aims of custodial sentencing, imprisonment should not be imposed. Specifically, this relates to whether the risk posed to women and their dependents outweighs the risk associated with their crime. To determine a fair sentence for all, both wider society and the offender and her children. It is critical that the justice system strikes the right balance when determining sentencing, and a pre-sentence report can inform this. So I am particularly glad that this bill does not affect Court of Appeal case law when pre-sentence reports are necessary or desirable in cases concerning women who are pregnant, victims of domestic abuse or have recently given birth. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe that many of these issues raised today speak to a wider issue pertaining to women's experiences in the justice and sentence system more broadly. Ensuring access to pre-sentence reports helps courts make informed, fair and just decisions. And for women in vulnerable circumstances, that can make all the difference.
I call Sir Ashley Fox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This bill is unfortunately necessary because of the unwise actions of the Sentencing Council. While the Lord Chancellor is right to bring this bill forward, she only did so at the very last moment. It was on Monday 31st March, mere hours before those guidelines were due to come into force, that the Sentencing Council was forced to perform a U-turn. Those guidelines would have led to a two-tier justice system in England and Wales. Now, the Sentencing Council didn't withdraw those guidelines out of wisdom or principle. They did so because they were caught out. Their backtrack was quietly communicated to judges and magistrates several hours after courts had already opened on Tuesday. To make matters worse, their message said they still believed that the policy was necessary. There was nothing necessary about that policy. Under the proposed guidelines, judges and magistrates were told that pre-sentence reports should normally be required when sentencing individuals from ethnic, faith or cultural minority groups. And what about those who are white, male and not part of a specified minority? They would not have fallen within this description. The implication was clear. Defendants will be treated differently, not based on their actions or the harm they've caused, but based on their identity. And that is wrong. And it was only after the intervention of my right honourable friend, the Shadow Justice Secretary, that the Lord Chancellor rightly took action. Race, culture and religion should never determine whether you go to prison or not. The Lord Chancellor said she was willing to legislate to stop this travesty if the Sentencing Council refused to back down. And that is what we're now doing. This is about the most fundamental principle in a free society: equality before the law. The question we must now ask ourselves is how the Sentencing Council got this so badly wrong, and judging by the comments of Lord Justice Davis, would continue to get wrong. Their guidelines would have had real consequences. In borderline cases, where a judge is unsure whether to issue a custodial sentence or not, the presence or absence of a pre-sentence report could be decisive. The whole purpose of these reports is to influence the outcome. By tilting the system toward giving those reports preferentially to certain identity groups, the Council would effectively be tipping the scales of justice. And they know it. Baroness Faulkner, Chair of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, has warned that the guidelines may violate the Equality Act. If we allow sentencing outcomes to be guided by race, faith or cultural identity, we abandon the core British principle that the law applies equally to all of us. I agree with the Lord Chancellor that we should pass this legislation to override this guidance. But I ask her, how confident is she that we won't face a similar situation again? I would like her to go further and ensure that Parliament is given oversight of all future sentencing guidance. We must put into law the principle that no factor like race, religion or cultural minority status should ever influence sentencing procedures. Justice, Madam Deputy Speaker, must remain blind, not selectively blinkered. If we lose equal justice, we lose the foundation of a free society. Thank you.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome this bill and the swift action taken by the Lord Chancellor to correct what is a clear wrong. Had they been implemented, the Sentencing Council's new guidelines would have introduced differential treatment before the law, something that can never and should never be acceptable. But the question is, how did we get to this point? Did these guidelines simply appear out of nowhere? Well, of course they didn't. They were subject to an extensive consultation under the previous Conservative government, a government that welcomed them without reservation. So let's be clear. The consultation published in November 2023 and closed in February 24 indicated that a pre-sentence report may be particularly important if the offender belonged to ethnic, cultural or faith minority communities. The then Conservative Sentencing Minister wrote to the Sentencing Council thanking them and welcoming the expanded guidance on the circumstances in which courts should seek pre-sentence reports. So let us be crystal clear. It was the last Conservative government that endorsed the idea that it was particularly important to request pre-sentence reports for individuals from ethnic, cultural or faith minority backgrounds, and therefore, by extension of basic logic, less important for other groups. The Sentencing Council had their answer. The then Conservative government supported their changes. Now, given what we've heard today, there must surely have been a flurry of opposition in certain quarters. So what did the now Shadow Justice Secretary say about it at the time? The answer is nothing. What did the Leader of the Opposition say? Nothing. Perhaps if they had bothered to stand up and do their job, as Labour has today, these guidelines would never have been issued in the first place. Now, for all the failings of the last Conservative government, many members were appalled by the outright refusal to amend these guidelines when requested to do so by the Justice Secretary. This refusal is the reason we find ourselves here today. Far too much of the British state now appears to operate beyond the reach of those democratically elected to lead it. There are too many quangos, too many faceless bureaucracies, too many levers of powers seemingly detached from those the people chosen to govern. The British public do not understand how a court can block the deportation of a convicted criminal who the government wishes to remove from the country. They do not understand how a Chancellor is constrained in their decision-making by the actions of an unelected Office for Budget Responsibility. And they do not understand how a Justice Secretary can simply not prevent unequal treatment before the law. This bill is the right response to this specific situation. But how long before we find ourselves here again, in another standoff with the Sentencing Council, over another issue where unelected officials clash with democratically accountable politicians? In the fullness of time, and I welcome the words of the Lord Chancellor today in terms of her further review, I believe we will have to go further. I believe we should abolish the Sentencing Council altogether.
Bedford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What the Sentencing Council ludicrously proposed was nothing short of two-tier justice. Guidelines that would mean young black, Asian or indeed other non-white offenders could have received more lenient sentences than their white counterparts in the exact same circumstances. But let me be clear, justice must be equality before the law. As someone once said, justice must not only be done, but be seen to be done. It should not depend on your race, the colour of your skin, your culture, or your religion. And it's high time we remind the unelected, unaccountable, and quite frankly, woke quangos that equality means treating everyone the same and not creating one rule for some and one rule for others. So I'm glad, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we have finally reached the second reading of this bill that will stop the madness espoused by this out-of-touch Liberal dinner party set advisory body. For far too long, bodies such as the Sentencing Council have been allowed to rule the roost. Such bodies and quangos are costing the taxpayer in excess of £64 billion a year for unserious and wasteful organisations. Parliament must be sovereign and should not continue to come up against a brick wall of regulatory and bureaucratic obstacles. Madam Deputy Speaker, I can't help but sense déjà vu. I was sat in this very place well over a month ago when my right honourable friend, the Shadow Lord Chancellor, brought forward legislation that would have prevented this slide into a two-tier justice. And all this while the Lord Chancellor allowed the Chairman of the Sentencing Council to effectively run rings around her, the government and the will of this House. Let's stop pretending. Sadly, two-tier justice does exist and the British people know it. Just look at the facts. People are being thrown into jail for making stupid comments online, whilst grooming gangs were able to operate unchallenged for fear of cultural sensitivities. This is wrong, and the British people demand that it ends now. And it's not just the courts. Police forces in the UK have been caught blocking white applicants from jobs, not based on ability, but merely based on the colour of their skin. How on earth did we get here? This is the country of the Magna Carta, the birthplace of common law. Some of the greatest legal minds the world has ever seen. Yet, we have an unelected quango, proposed guidelines that is openly discriminatory, and where equality before the law has been replaced by ideology over fairness.
Shadow Minister Mike Wood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Equality before the law is at the heart of the rule of law. As the great Roman statesman Cicero said, for rights that were not open to all alike would be no rights. But the revised guidelines from the Sentencing Council fundamentally went against this important principle. To introduce a presumption that pre-sentencing reports would be required not necessarily because of particular vulnerability of offenders or circumstances related to their offence, but because of the colour of their skin, the region of their ancestors' origin, or the religious beliefs that they hold, is two-tier justice, no matter how laudable the intentions. This isn't about Court of Appeal judgments like Thompson that the Lord Chancellor referred to, around factors that could fundamentally change the effect that particular judicial sentences may have on an offender or relate directly to the circumstances of the offence. This is purely about those characteristics. Now, my right honourable friend, the Shadow Lord Chancellor, did not only this House, but our country, a huge service when he raised this matter from the dispatch box on the 5th of March, because it was clear that the Lord Chancellor was completely blindsided. Neither she nor her ministers knew anything about those proposals. In fairness to the Right Honourable Lady, who's not back in her seat at the moment, I'm sure that she was as appalled as we were at the idea that people should be treated differently purely because of their ethnicity, culture or religion. But this is a lacklustre bill to do the minimum needed to clear up the immediate mess of this government's making. As I've said, it's the minimum necessary. It's better than nothing. It's a very small step in the right direction, but it doesn't go as far as the government should be to actually introduce the reforms that are needed. The Right Honourable Lady had been Lord Chancellor for 8 months, but had so little grip of her department that she had not only done nothing to stop, but wasn't even aware of the Sentencing Council's new guidelines. Her representative had met with the Sentencing Council just 2 days earlier. What were they doing there if it wasn't to stop proposals like these? How is the Right Honourable Lady running her department if she was not even informed of this? Because these proposals had changed during that process, and the Lord Chancellor, unlike myself and unlike the Business Secretary, actually is or has been a practising lawyer. She would understand that there is a substantial difference in the effect of saying that a pre-sentence report may be particularly important and requiring that a pre-sentence report will normally be considered necessary in terms of the effect it has, the triggers for appeals against sentencing. And yet, those changes were made almost at the point that the Right Honourable Lady became Lord Chancellor, and yet 8 months later, she'd done nothing to stop it, wasn't even aware of it. And now this bill comes forward that just stops the very, very narrowest and worst aspects of these guidelines. But if the government was actually serious about taking action, it could have taken action much more quickly. It didn't even need to take action. Purely an omission would have been sufficient. On the 28th of March, when my Right Honourable friend, the Shadow Lord Chancellor, brought forward his private member's bill, all the government whips had to do was not shout object in order for that bill to go forward, that would have restored proper ministerial oversight and, through the Minister, parliamentary oversight over sentencing guidelines, and so allowing Parliament to take control over this fundamental matter. Of course I will.
Grateful to my friend. He's right, it's not just these guidelines. In the last Parliament, we legislated to increase the maximum sentence for causing death by dangerous driving to life imprisonment, but an offender killed 3 members of my constituents' family and was only given 10.5 years sentence. So does he agree that we need that broader power so that where Parliament's intent is not recognised by the Sentencing Council, we can act?
I think, Honourable Friend, and clearly Parliament needs to be able to have the oversight over revisions of sentencing guidelines so that those guidelines do reflect the will of Parliament. But the government failed to act and has now brought forward this lacklustre measure. In the past few months, my honourable and right honourable friends have uncovered multiple instances of these two-tier principles being applied in matters relating to bail and to probation and other judicial matters. This is not a one-off, a whistle-blow, fix-it-and-move-on situation. It is systemic, it is endemic. We need much more radical reform than the government is bringing forward today. So when will the government, I have to wrap up, so when will the government get serious, get a grip and put an end to this, not just now, but once and for all?
Call Minister Sir Nick Dakin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank all honourable and right honourable members on all sides of the House for their valuable contributions. And I think what I heard from the shadow spokesman at the end there was a support for this bill, and I thank him for that. Today's debate has been a helpful one and has underscored the broad support for this legislation and the principle of equality before the law. Many members, in pretty much every member that's spoken, has underlined the importance of the principle of equality before the law. And I'm proud that my right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, acted so swiftly to address this situation, and in a way which was courteous and respectful to all involved to get to the point we are today. But whilst we have had much agreement, my right honourable friend, the Mother of the House, who I have the highest regard for, announced herself as being in a minority of one, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure that is not the case, but she did draw attention to her serious concerns about disproportionality in the criminal justice system. And I can say to her that We share her concerns about disproportionality, and that's why my right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, has announced a proper review of all the data so that we will know what the actions are that will address properly this disproportionality and bring about change, and change in a way that addresses the seriousness of the unfairness in the system to which she rightly alluded. Equality before the law is a fundamental principle of our criminal justice system. It's the government's policy and belief that this should be protected. We know that more must be done to address inequalities in the justice system, and we're committed, absolutely committed, to tackling racial disparities across the criminal justice system. We're also taking steps such as increasing diversity in our staff and working with the judiciary to make sure that our appointments are reflective of the society we serve. This has included supporting underrepresented groups to join the judiciary and the magistrates. This involves widely supported outreach programmes run by the MOJ and partners and work to reduce barriers to individuals joining. But we do need to do much, much more. And I commend my honourable friend for keeping us on notice. Yeah. But I also promise her that we will deliver. The honourable member for Eastbourne, who speaks for the Liberal Democrats, reminded us, as indeed the member for Hartlepool did, that these guidelines were nodded through by the previous Conservative government. And he also reminded us of the inheritance that we've had of an underfunded probation and court system, which has led to, in his words, a rationing of pre-sentence reports. And I agree with him that the debate should be about how we move to universality of pre-sentence reports, not about rationing. And of course, none of this debate alters the fact that independent judges can ask for pre-sentence reports whenever they feel it is necessary. And indeed, the Lord Chancellor, in her opening speech, made clear that capacity is being increased so that more pre-sentence reports can be done, and quite properly. We had very helpful contributions from my honourable friend, the Chair of the Select Committee, and the honourable member for Kenilworth and Southam, both of whom drew attention to the importance of pre-sentence reports in identifying the most appropriate and effective sentence for individual offenders. The Chair of the Select Committee gave us the full timeline of this affair, and also a good analysis of where we are with the bill up to date. And I agree with him that we'll have more opportunity to look at that in detail at the committee stage. And likewise, the member for Kenilworth and Southam also drew attention to his concerns about the breadth of the bill, and again, which will have opportunity to examine further at committee stage. My honourable friend, the member for Stoke-on-Trent South, raised very serious concerns in relation to the issues relating to pregnant women, and was pleased that this does not affect the Court of Appeal case law in that respect. In fact, nothing in this bill, as she helpfully reminded the House, prevents judges from requesting PSRs for pregnant women. Judges will continue to be able to request PSRs in cases where they ordinarily would, including, for example, appropriate cases involving pregnant women, and we would expect this to continue. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm happy to have heard so much support for this bill during the debate today. There will be a drop-in on the next stages of the bill on Monday for MPs to answer any other questions that members of this House have, and to feed into the process prior to us coming to the committee stage next week. This emergency legislation, while it is a small bill, is of great significance. It will stop the Sentencing Council's updated guidelines on pre-sentence reports from coming into force and safeguard against the risk of differential treatment arising from their use. The action taken by the government on this issue underscores our commitment to equality before the law, something that all honourable members who have spoken in the debate have underlined today and is most important, the ancient principle on which our justice system was built. I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no.
Aye.
I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Programme motion to be moved formally.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.